Okay. Good morning. It's really my pleasure to be here today. My name is Erik McDuffie, and I am a jointly appointed assistant professor in the Gender and Women's Studies program in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I am really honored and delighted to be here and to introduce this morning's panel, or rather I should say at this point almost this afternoon's panel, Black Women, Communism, and Social Transformation. I will introduce each speaker before they give their paper. And I should note that this panel, as well as this conference, is part of a growing wave of scholarly interest in this topic. A number of scholars, including those on this panel, as well as, of course, Angela Davis, Gerald Horn, Marika Sherwood, Kate Wiegand, Dale Gore, Rebecca Welsh, Jacqueline Castledine, Rebecca Hill, and others, are recovering and critically examining Black women's engagement with U.S. communism. And before I get started, I was asked to give a few remarks. Again, I think it is important that we certainly acknowledge the important work and life and legacy of John Hope Franklin. His book, From Slavery to Freedom, certainly is a classic. And indeed, not only, again, should we acknowledge his fine work, but of course, again, this is a tribute to Charlene Mitchell and Dorothy Burnham, Rosa Gee, Winnie Burroughs, Dorothy Burnham, women who again played a critical role in helping to lay the groundwork for the civil rights Black power movements, as well as modern Black feminism, and we'll hear more about that. So again, I was asked to give a few opening words about Black women's involvement in the U.S. Communist Party, CPUSA, during the Old Left period. The movement bookended by the 1917 Russian Revolution and by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's denunciations of Stalinist atrocities in 1956. An extraordinary group of Black women activists, writers, teachers, and world travelers, including Claudia Jones, Louise Thompson Patterson, Esther Cooper Jackson, Audley Queen Mother Moore, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Grace P. Campbell, Beulah Richardson, Charlene Mitchell, Sally Bell Davis, Dorothy Burnham, Vicki Garvin, and others pursued a transformative politics within communist-affiliated movements during the early and mid-20th century. Brilliant, trailblazing activists and theoreticians, these women gained reputations as leaders within Black communities and the global left. They took part in the communist left because they saw it as a powerful vehicle with real and imagined links to the global political stage for advancing Black liberation, Black women's freedom, decolonization, human rights, economic justice, peace, and international solidarity. By tracing their personal histories, political encounters, global travels, and activist careers, we can see how Black women radicals forged a distinct, path-breaking brand of radical politics. They countered prevailing assumptions within the communist left about racial, gender, and class assumptions that constructed the worker as a white male factory laborer, the working woman as white, and the shop floor as the determinant of class consciousness. Instead, Black Party women recognized how Black women's employment as domestics in white women's homes, the constant threat of rape and denigration of Black women's bodies and reputations by their oppressors, and the intractable issues facing diasporic communities' very survival were critical in shaping Black women's materiality and consciousness. Given Black women's location at the interstices of multiple oppressions, Black women radicals charged that Black women across the diaspora, not white working class men as orthodox Marxism-Leninism posited, represented the vanguard for radical change globally. In doing so, Black women radicals attempted to recenter the communist left by arguing that Black working class women's concerns were essential, not peripheral, to Black and women's liberation and the global socialist struggle. These conclusions prompted Black radical women to devote special attention to organizing and protecting Black working class women and to forging transnational bonds of political solidarity with women across the diaspora and beyond. years ahead of their time. They also theorized on the relationship between the personal and the political, appreciating the importance of eradicating sexism both in the public and private spheres. Black women radicals sometimes pursued practices that challenged prevailing heteronormative gender norms and ideas about middle-class respectability. And I think it's important to keep in mind that these women not only fought as individuals, but they formed communities of struggle. In fact, if you talk to Dorothy Burnham or Mary Louise Patterson, the daughter of Louise Thompson Patterson, you so often hear about how these women again were very close friends, and how they inspired one another, how they encouraged their husbands to take part in child rearing practices, to rethink what it meant to be a black man, what it meant to be a black woman, to rethink black sexuality. Again, these folks were ahead of their times. Given this expansive liberatory political vision, old left black women's work anticipated 1970s era radical black feminism of the Third World Women's Alliance and the Combahee River Collective. Certainly, we can see these ideas in the work of Louise Thompson Patterson, a vivacious activist who emerged as a leading figure in the Harlem Renaissance, a world traveler, and the leading black woman in the Communist Party during the 1930s. She was at the forefront of building and leading 1930s and 1940s left liberal coalitions known as the Popular Front, focused on civil rights, anti-fascism, internationalism, and the celebration of black culture. Harlem community activists like Audley Moore and Bonita Williams organized mass movements around cost of living issues, galvanizing thousands of ordinary black women into action. As Dr. Davis noted, the Southern Negro Youth Congress, a militant forerunner of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, played a key role in advancing civil rights struggles during the 40s and 50s, or rather during the late 30s and 40s. And in fact, we can see that black women played very visible roles in leading this organization, such as, of course, again, Esther Cooper Jackson and Dorothy Burnham and Sally Bow Davis, of course, the mother of Angela Davis. Claudia Jones's 1949, An End to the Neglect of the Issues of Negro Women, and Beulah Richardson's powerful 1951 poem, A Black Woman Speaks of White Womanhood, of White Supremacy of Peace, examined black women's triple exploitation, understood how rape was critical in shaping black women's lives, and that fighting against rape needed to be central, not peripheral, to black struggles. No issue galvanized black women in the black left during the late 40s and early 50s than the case of Rosalie Ingram, a 40-year-old Georgia sharecropper and widowed mother of 14, who along with two of her sons faced death for killing in self-defense a white would-be rapist in 1947. Although rarely mentioned in the master narrative of the post-war black freedom movement, Ingram, through the amnesty campaign on her behalf, became a household name in African-American communities, generating worldwide publicity. Black women took the lead in building interracial movements and internationalizing the case on the eve of the civil rights movement. The Cold War, of course, stands as a very important turning point in black women's lives, black radical women's lives. In some ways, both the best of times and the worst of times. And we'll talk more about the impact of McCarthyism on the lives. But what is important to keep in mind is how black women survived, how black women's radicalism survived the Cold War, the McCarthy period, helping again to lay the foundations of 1970s black feminism. So, with time being of the essence here, telling black women's radicalist history does more than simply add to what we already know about black radicalism, black feminism, transnational women's movements, the Cold War, and the U.S. left. Their histories shake up our understanding of the past. They reveal the ideological complexities of 20th century black feminism and transnational women's movements, provide a genealogy for intersectional thought, highlight the complex interplay between race, gender, class, sexuality, and politics within U.S. communism, and above all, illustrate how black women on the left forged their own brand of radical politics. This panel will show why. That said, my paper is titled "The Sojourners for Truth and Justice, Black Women in the Radical Tradition During the Early Cold War." This paper is drawn from my book manuscript, tentatively titled "Toward a Brighter Dawn, Black Women and American Communism, 1919 through 1956." By tracing the personal histories, political encounters, and activist careers of Louise Thompson Patterson, Esther Cooper Jackson, Charlene Mitchell, Claudia Jones, and others. This book recovers black left feminism, a path-breaking brand of feminist politics combining black nationalist and American Communist Party positions on race, gender, and class with black women radicals' own lived experiences focused on black working class women. As coined by literary scholar Mary Helen Washington, the term black left feminism describes the post-World War II literary work of black women radicals. In my book, I draw on and reframe this term to examine a distinct radical black feminist politics and subject position that formed and evolved during the entire Old Left period. This paper briefly examines the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. From its opening convention in 1951 to its demise less than 2 years later, these Sojourners defied an increasingly repressive political order. The first and only group of its kind during the entire Old Left period explicitly organized to, quote, "fight for full freedom of the Negro people and the dignity of Negro womanhood," end quote. The Sojourners sought to mobilize black women against Jim Crow, U.S. Cold War, domestic and foreign policy, and colonialism. It demanded freedom for the unjustly sentenced, such as Rosalie Ingram. Sojourners called for the freedom of Council on African Affairs CAA leader Alpheus Hunton, jailed for his left-wing affiliations. It insisted that the U.S. government stop persecuting those who spoke out against racism, colonialism, and the Cold War, including W.B. Du Bois, charged in 1951 as an, quote, "agent of a foreign principle in the United States," end quote. Paul Robeson, whose passport the Justice Department had confiscated in 1950, and Claudia Jones, who had been arrested in 1951 for allegedly violating the Smith Act, a law that outlawed calls for violently overthrowing the U.S. states. Like the left-wing Civil Rights Congress, CRC, the Sojourners embraced the causes of human rights, black equality, women's rights, peace, and international solidarity. However, the repressive Cold War atmosphere, together with the Communist Party's ambivalence towards the group, contribute to the Sojourners' untimely demise. Until recently, the history of the Sojourners has received only cursory treatment from scholars interested in African American, or rather in black women's history, diasporic feminism, black radicalism, the Cold War, and U.S. women's movements. Recovering the group's history highlights how black women radicals forged black left feminism, viewing triply oppressed black women across the diaspora as the vanguard of radical global social change. Key to the Sojourners program was its formulation of a human rights agenda. Although they rarely employ the idiom of human rights to describe their work, black left feminism, white supremacy, the subjugation of black womanhood, lynching, and black poverty as forms of genocide. These practices, along with political persecution and colonialism, represented a violation of basic, universal, inalienable human freedoms, such as the rights of life, freedom of conscience, and the right of self-determination protected in the United Nations Human Rights Declarations. These politics directly confronted U.S. Cold War policy, as human rights by the early 1950s became associated with Soviet subversion. As Cold War civil rights emerged as the prevailing racial discourse and the post-war discourse of domesticity sought to push women back into the home. Excavating the Sojourners' work is important not simply because it tells a fascinating story of a remarkable group. Rather, the Sojourners are important because its work contains significant implications for rethinking standard narratives of black radicalism, black feminism, the U.S. left, and transnational women's movements, underscoring again how black women militants forged their own identity in radical politics at the height of the McCarthy period. Briefly, because time is short, the group was formed in September of 1951. It was a direct outgrowth, was very much inspired by Beulah Richardson's very powerful poem, Black Women's Speech, but again, also inspired by post-war black militancy, shifts in the Communist Party's positions towards the ultra-left, and also again inspired by emerging third world national liberation movements. In September of 1951, they issued the Call to Negro Woman, their founding manifesto, which was really very much ahead of its time and for offering a kind of intersectional, transnational lens or transnational understanding of black women's plight and status. The Sojourners directly challenged U.S. Cold War policy by, again, trying to internationalize the Ingram case and by openly calling for the end of the war. Following, in fact, the call also announced the group's inaugural convention in September, at the end of September and early October '51, in which 132 black women in D.C. attended. In fact, black women actually sent delegations to the Pentagon, to the State Department, to try to meet with U.S. government officials to discuss their grievances. Following the convention, some Sojourners signed the We Charge Genocide petition written by William L. Patterson that charged the U.S. with genocide for violating African Americans' human rights. In contrast to the NAACP and the National Council of Negro Women's Anti-Communist Internationalism of the post-war period, the Sojourners sought to internationalize the black freedom struggle. So what's important to keep in mind is that as mainstream black civil rights groups were heading towards the right, following the end of World War II and as the Cold War intensified, the Sojourners moved to the left. The Sojourners, in fact, what's very fascinating is that they actually tried to forge transnational ties and connections with anti-apartheid activists in South Africa. In 1952, Sojourners corresponded directly with anti-apartheid activists. In fact, they received a response. In fact, ANC Women League official Bertha Mckenzie warmly answered the group's letter by thanking them for, quote, having made it possible the link we have always wished for on this side of the world. By corresponding with militant South African women activists, the Sojourners accomplished one of its main objectives, forging transnational links with third world women. But communist short-sightedness and Cold War repression soon dashed these connections. In brief, the group only survived for about a year or so, in part due to Communist Party ambivalence towards the group. Communists had never dealt before with an all-black women's organization, so we certainly cannot rule out how racism and sexism inside the communist movement affected how they saw the Sojourners. But really, most importantly, McCarthyism played a key role in shutting down the group. Within little more than 1 year, the FBI compiled 450 pages of files on the group. The group shut down by early '52. Conclusions and legacies. Despite the virulence of Cold War repression, anti-communism neither quelled black women radicals' freedom dreams nor their efforts in pursuing a left-wing, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-imperialist agenda immediately following the Sojourners' demise and after the McCarthy period of the early '50s. Following the group's demise, Louise Thompson Patterson and Beulah Richardson organized the short-lived Committee of 100 Women, clearly taking its cue from the Sojourners and other post-war black left and interracial groups. The New York-based committee sought to organize black and white women, progressives around civil rights, civil liberties, women's rights, and the defense of political prisoners. In the early '70s, Thompson Patterson emerged as a major figure in the Free Angela Davis movement. Former Sojourner Esther Cooper Jackson co-founded and edited Freedom Ways, a quarterly review of the Negro movement from 1961 through '85. This magazine was really quite ahead of its time in that it published some of the earliest works by Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Toni Morrison. The Sojourners' brief history calls our attention to the extraordinary efforts of a small but dynamic community of black women radicals in forging a path-breaking left-wing feminist praxis, one that was transnational in breadth and committed to challenging U.S. Cold War domestic and foreign policy and to supporting human rights, black freedom, black women's freedom, and decolonization. Although inspired by Marxism-Leninism, Sojourners refashioned it, locating black women across the diaspora as the vanguard of global radical change. They took on U.S. Cold War policy. For this stance, Cold Warriors targeted the group. At the same time, Sojourners' independence from the CPUSA deeply troubled some party officials, and black anti-communist liberals had nothing to do with the Sojourners, leaving them with few allies and making them even more vulnerable to state repression. How might the course of black radicalism in the U.S. and across the diaspora, the U.S. left, and women's movements and third world independence movements have been different had groups such as the Sojourners been able to thrive? Of course, this is impossible to say, but what we can say is that the Sojourners not only challenged dominant narratives of the U.S. Black freedom movement, diasporic radicalism and feminism, the communist left and U.S. women's movements, the group also speaks to the complexities and brilliance of black women's activism, underscoring how they so often had been at the lead in protecting diasporic communities and forging progressive visions for a brighter, more equitable world for us all. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Lauren Kientz. I'm a PhD candidate at Michigan State University, and I'm really glad to be with you today. I'm super excited to introduce you to Mabel J. Byrd, who is someone who is just not known and yet fascinating, so I hope you enjoy this. I have some images that we weren't able to show, so if you'd like to see them afterwards, I can show you what she looked like. Some rough, very rough newspaper photographs. In 1932, Mabel J. Byrd publicly supported the Communist Party for president in a clear and enthusiastic essay on the crisis. Within the next year, she became the first African American hired by the national government to prevent discrimination within the National Recovery Administration, a part of the New Deal. She had begun her career a decade before within the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, known for its moderate approach to interracialism, before spending 2 years at the League of Nations, studying African and African American workers. Returning to the States, she researched black economic conditions with Charles Johnson at Fisk, while pursuing graduate study in economics at the University of Chicago. Her life, as Brent Hayes Edwards has suggested, elucidates, quote, the complex parameters of African diasporic radicalism in all its varieties. I suggest that Byrd's path does not represent a simple conversion story from cautious YWCA worker to dedicated communist. Rather, her time in the YWCA and in Europe opened her to the possibilities of interracialism and internationalism, even though she eventually found the YW's individualist approach inadequate. At the same time, she developed love for African American culture that she shared with her colleagues in Harlem, Geneva, and Chicago. She was a race-proud internationalist, embracing the African diaspora and interracial unity. She turned to the CP because it offered her and other African Americans real action towards equality, not the empty rhetoric of other parties. This is also a story particular to 1932, a moment when the CPUSA was very focused on African American rights. Vivacious and intelligent, Mabel Byrd entered Harlem's social and intellectual life in the summer of 1923 at the age of 27 with a verve that propelled her into leadership. Within a few years, she was elected president of her local chapter of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority and the National Association of College Women, socializing with many powerful and intelligent women. Her sorority sisters included Eslanda Robeson and Yolande Du Bois. During the day, Byrd took on many responsibilities in the YW, particularly while during her free time, co-workers introduced her to new Negro luminaries, particularly W.E.B. Du Bois. In Portland, Oregon, where she grew up, she had been the executive secretary of her YW after graduating from the University of Washington in 1921. In Harlem, she was one of many secretaries in a community of black college graduates. And part of the chapter I had to not present today is about that community and how essential that community was, which is, I was very touched by Angela Davis's remark about community earlier. Within the YW, Byrd became acquainted with the difficult lives led by industrial workers and with the inchoate efforts YWs made at interracialism. In her local YW, Byrd was industrial secretary, educating women workers, socializing with them, helping to improve their working conditions, and listening to their stories. She also participated in several interracial conferences, some of which became so only through the strenuous efforts of her cohort. Though the YW bowed to many forms of segregation and discrimination, their rhetoric encouraged peace, unity, and brotherhood, sisterhood above all else. In the wake of World War I, the YW published a pamphlet to help educate Americans about race relations. Its readers were told that, quote, among the many evils with which our American life is confronted, none seems so acute or aggravated as the relationship between the races. And until Christian white women stand by Negro women, giving them that human protection and respect, which is the right of womanhood the world over, there will be little progress in racial solutions. Black women YW workers believed this rhetoric to different extents, some believing it held the promise of the future, while others believing present hypocrisies annulled its promises of unity. At this point, Byrd was somewhere in the middle. She held out hope for the possibilities of interracialism while turning a keen mind to every instance of hypocrisy. In the midst of industrial work for the YW, Byrd began focusing on broader questions of economics and politics, perhaps because she wanted to increase her effectiveness in helping industrial workers. To explore her questions, she went to Europe to study economic conditions in England, France, and Germany. Byrd's desire to go abroad can be explained in part by all the stories of European openness to African American visitors swirling around her social circles in Harlem. Yet it was her particular interest that led her into economic research rather than cultural activities. All of Harlem's literati and social denizens turned out to wish 31-year-old Mabel Byrd goodbye at a musical tea Easter Sunday, 1927. Langston Hughes read poetry, Arna Bontemps, the Du Bois, the Johnsons, everybody was there. Later, in the midst of a summer studying settlement houses, Byrd attended an International Student Services, ISS, conference in Scheer, Switzerland. The formal report of the conference published her remarks to the group. Byrd used the conference as the platform she had envisaged when she wrote Du Bois earlier in the summer requesting material on the Fourth Pan-African Congress, which her group of women was planning, and recent issues of the crisis. She drew attention to the shared desire for freedom and equal rights that African Americans held with colonial subjects, who had received the bulk of attention at the conference. Byrd's parting words for her audience challenged them to consider the Christian roots of the organization and their own conduct. Quote, "Hypocrisy is characterizing religious effort today, and if we are going to speak of the principles of Christianity in dealing with the race question, we must live in accordance with those principles." Her words echoed Juliette Derricott's, a sorority sister that had visited a similar meeting 4 years before, but had a significant difference. Derricott always wrote about religion from within it. Her passionate faith showed through even when illuminating Christians' hypocrisies. In contrast, Byrd here spoke as if she were outside or a bit distant from religion, a distance that would smooth her transition to communism later. Byrd's experience of real internationalism, begun at this conference, continued when she moved to Geneva in the fall of 1927. At the ISS conference, she had become intensely interested in the question of international government and made the contacts that led her to a position with the International Labor Office, the ILO, affiliated with the League of Nations, where she was able to expand her summer study of European economies into 2 years focusing on African and African American laborers. That summer, she went to visit in London Elaine Locke and Paul and Islanda Robeson in the summer of 1928, and they formulated a campaign of propaganda about black equality that she should pursue in Geneva. The Robesons leaned left, though they had not yet become communists. Returning to Geneva in September, she assured Locke that she was hard at it and implored him to send her copies of The New Negro. And these letters are wonderful, but I'm pressing on. Byrd also encouraged African Americans touring Europe to stop in Geneva to talk to her colleagues at the ILO. Poet County Cullen visited in October. She eagerly anticipated Cullen's visit, both for his companionship and for his ability to influence her colleagues. She hosted him with the full strength of her new internationalism, which, unlike that described by many scholars, combined attention to the diaspora with a desire for international, interracial fellowship encouraged by the YWCA and the ISS. She planned a soiree for Cullen's visit with the directors of the International Club. Cullen wrote to crisis readers about his visit. He was particularly impressed by the diversity of people with which they socialized and how much interest Byrd's propaganda campaign had stimulated. Quote, "Geneva and a happy week there as the guest of the Quaker Hostel, all arranged through Mabel Byrd, formerly of the Brooklyn and New York YWCAs. International gatherings where every conceivable race and country were represented. The air shot through with intense hopes and prophecies for world peace, the brotherhood of the races, the millennium, and always and everywhere a keen interest in the Negro, in many instances a livelier knowledge of what he is doing than is found in his own purlieus." Byrd's ISS and ILO friends all hoped for a place where a diversity of people could be brothers and sisters rather than enemies. Cullen caught the scent of that hope, but sensed it would only come with the mythic millennium. Byrd could have a greater hope because she had in fact experienced that fellowship over the past year, rather than only catching a faint whiff on a brief visit. In 1929, when she returned to the States, Charles Johnson, one of her friends from Harlem, invited her as a research fellow at the Fisk University, and she spent a year going throughout the South researching economic conditions. And there's another great story about her interaction with E. Franklin Frazier, and there's some complications at Fisk. So that caused her to leave rather prematurely. In fall 1931, Byrd moved to the University of Chicago to pursue her master's degree in economics, funded by a scholarship from the Rosenwald Fund. An unknown white woman requested her as a roommate, making her the first black woman to reside in the dormitories. She entered a place Richard Wright later described as, quote, the city from which the most incisive and radical Negro thought has come. There is an open and raw beauty about that city that seems either to kill or endow one with the spirit of life. The air was alive with communist sentiment. Neither major party offered hope for those blacks staring into the depths of the Depression. Protests filled the streets around the world over the Scottsboro trial, and after 4 years of self-determination rhetoric, white communists had begun to throw out members who abided by segregation. And then, the Communist National Nominating Convention came to town, the summer after Byrd's first year in graduate school. On May 28th to 29th, 1932, Byrd watched the speeches and discussions in the Chicago Coliseum unfold with eager eyes. When she walked in the doors at the convention, Byrd immediately noticed that she was not the lone black figure in the room, as she had been so often in her classrooms of late. Fully 15% of the members and 25% of the speakers were African Americans. Byrd, a woman who had been in Harlem during the height of the Renaissance, said that the black speakers at this conference were, quote, the most articulate Negro group that I have ever seen assembled. These men and women, still with the dust of factory and field on their shoulders, spoke at the convention not only about the injustices they had suffered, seeing, quote, ahead of them struggle, fight, hardship, but they also visualized a society in which equality will be an actuality. Not only did they decry white chauvinism, but they, quote, suggested means for its eventual extinction. Theirs is a philosophy of hope and enthusiasm that has not been known since the days of emancipation. Byrd watched the progression of speakers with awe. No matter the outcome of the election, she later wrote, quote, these truths seem to be increasingly self-evident. The Negro masses are now speaking for themselves, as evidenced on the convention floor. They are becoming increasingly aware of their status in the American Commonwealth. Through their conception of and belief in the philosophy and program of the Communist Party, they are awakening that attribute for so long made dormant by the Negro's social and political environment. Self-respect. Then, amidst an explosion of cheering, the 1,000 delegates unanimously nominated black Alabaman James W. Ford, whose grandfather had been lynched, as their vice presidential candidate. You can imagine the joy that this was met with, since we have seen a similar nomination in Chicago 76 years later. Byrd wrote up news of the convention for the Associated Negro Press, which went out nationally to black newspapers. When a few months later, Du Bois requested essays espousing the various political positions in the presidential race that year FDR was running, she eagerly wrote on behalf of the communists, fully convinced of their worth. The year after publishing this very public embrace of the Communist Party, Byrd became the first African American hired to trace discrimination within the National Recovery Administration, which is a whole other and fascinating story that you can ask me about if you want to. In 1934, she was elected secretary of a Communist French convention, the Congress of Women Against War and Fascism held in France. Soon afterwards, she married Dr. L.S. Curtis, a fellow economist and settled in St. Louis. Her name rises one more time in the historical record, so far as I have found, around a civil rights protest in that city in the 1950s. Mabel Byrd transformed into a communist for specific reasons at present lost to the historical record, but she has left many rich clues behind. From her early days in the YW, she sought to help industrial workers. When she went to Europe, it was to study economic conditions. Yet before her article on the crisis, I found no record of an interest in communism. In Geneva, when she wrote Du Bois and Locke for propaganda, she meant materials about African Americans and their situation and did not mention workers or communism. But what did she discuss with the Robesons in London, who were already beginning to lean left? And what conversations did she have with ILO colleagues, among whom communism was more accepted than in the United States? When she toured through Birmingham to Alabama to ask about industrial conditions, did she encounter the Alabama Communist Party? I propose that she embraced communism because in 1932 it suited her desire for race pride and autonomy, as well as internationalism and interracialism. She was a race-proud internationalist.
Good afternoon. And I love that. I live in London right now, and you say good afternoon to a crowd of people there, and they just kind of sit there and look at you. So every time I hear it today, I'm overjoyed. And I'm really glad to be a part of this work that I'm being introduced to. And so I hope today to introduce you to someone new. Her name is Olive Morris, and I came across Olive Morris because there's a building named after her in the Brixton area of London, which is the predominantly black area of the city. And in 1986, an ostensibly radical group of city councilors decided to commemorate a year of anti-racism. Just a year, limited to anti-racism. And they named a number of local sites after black leaders. And so there are 2 dead-end residential streets named after Marcus Garvey. And also, there's also Bob Marley Way. Interestingly, they meet at the dead end. But also, there's a social services building named after Mary Seacole, who was a nurse during the Crimean War, and they're often fond of calling her the Black Florence Nightingale, but I think she's actually quite valiant in her own right. And so there's a now derelict social services building named after her that's slated for demolition. But so the building that's named after Olive Morris is at 18 Brixton Hill Road, and it is the social services building. So I'm not sure whether or not the irony of naming this building after Olive Morris was lost or not on the councilors, but I'll tell you a bit about her and you can make your own assessment. She was active in the vibrant British squatters movement of the 1970s. And then she also was a founding member of a number of different organizations. She was a founding member of the Brixton Black Panthers, as well as the Brixton Black Women's Group, the National Coordinating Committee of Overseas Students. She went to school in Manchester, and she helped found the Black Women's Cooperative there, as well as the Black Women's Mutual Aid Group. And then she was also a part of the more well-known group, the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent. And so I think her activism demonstrates a commitment to black people's struggles, yet I think it also helps us to look at the notion of alliance building, and it stretches the boundary of what gets constituted historically as black struggle. So she came to my attention in 2003, and her picture was one of many that was displayed at the it's in Brixton, the Black Cultural Archives, which is a center devoted to documenting and celebrating black people's history in Britain. And I think below the photo was a summary of her work, but what was most striking was the concluding remark that it said, "Sister Olive died at the age of 27. And I immediately recalled the life and work of Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, who too worked unceasingly for black liberation with SNCC as a field activist, also an administrator, and ultimately elected to executive secretary before she died at the age of 25 from cancer. And so it's an unfortunate parallel, but I think that both of these women were big personalities and they accomplished a lot in the short time span that they were with us. And so they prompt a number of questions. One of those questions was about the parallels in their experience and the parallels in their political awakening. But also I think one thing that we've alluded to today is not to simply take the U.S. experience as the gold standard for all activism. And so I'm interested in looking at how we can use Olive Morris's life and activism to think about a distinctly Black and British tradition of Black women's activism. And so I approach her work through the notion of bridge leadership, which the sociologist Belinda Robnett outlined in her book about women in the civil rights movement titled How Long, How Long? And specifically, she notes the role of Black women serving as intermediaries between the movement leaders and the people. And also, I think she notes that they serve as valuable translators. So they're able to help people translate their personal grievances into action and how those things are impacted by structural constraints. And so I think that Olive Morris is someone who easily move between making connections between different groups of people. So she can help us see how this concept of bridge leadership can more broadly help us to think about activism across different movements, not just solely ones that we currently define as Black struggle. So at this particular moment in the UK, there's an upsurge in interest in Black women's activism. We're coming up on the 40th anniversary of the first Women's Liberation Conference that was held in Oxford. And so included in these remembrance projects, the Black Cultural Archives is conducting oral histories of Black women activists from the period, as well as training women in how to do oral histories, which I think is a really valuable skill to learn. And then also I'm a part of a group called the Remembering Olive Collective, which is dedicated to recovering Olive Morris's memory, but also making sure that they don't take her name off of that government building, which they have tried to do. Okay, just as a side note, I've been sent with buttons and posters to sell for the collective. I didn't know where to squeeze that in, so there it is. And also I think we've heard mention of Julia Sudbury's book, Other Kinds of Dreams, where she gives us an excellent detailed documentation of Black women's organizations, which we can learn a great deal about Black women's individual histories as they shaped Black British history. So whether that was through slavery or through voluntary migration or voluntary settlement, or even coming to the country as Commonwealth citizens. So, a bit about Olive. I think an early incident in her political awakening starts to demonstrate how she was what her brother Earl Morris characterized as a people's person. So the common folklore states that in 1969, at the age of 17, that Olive intervened when the police arrested a Black man driving a nice car. So that's how the story is told all over Brixton. In a photograph that was taken at King's College Hospital after her arrest, Olive appears disheveled. Her shirt is soiled, her face swollen, and on the reverse of the picture, she has noted the date and the time, and that the police had beaten her while she was in custody. So the story of her arrest and the photograph circulate as evidence of Olive's willingness to step into the fray and to do so boldly. In a Times newspaper report on the incident, they note that the man driving the nice car was in fact Clement Gomwalk, a diplomat with the Nigerian High Commission who'd illegally parked his Mercedes in a no-waiting zone while doing some shopping with his wife in the area. The report goes on to note that 6 people, not solely Olive, were arrested and charged with assault on police, threatening behavior, and possessing offensive weapons. As the Times later reports on her conviction, it said, quote, "During the melee, Miss Morris kicked a police officer and hit him on the jaw. She received a suspended 3-year jail sentence that was later reduced to 1 year suspended." So I raise the details of this event as it has come to signal Morris's entry into activism with police abuses in the community as it being a key feature of her activism, though of course it does sound like she did some abusing herself. Correcting the record to note that she did not, in fact, act alone doesn't detract from her bravery in intervening, but instead recasts Morris as an instigator of change. However, one gets the sense from her later activism that Morris actually didn't seem to care whether or not people followed her. Elaine Holness, a Brixton community activist who knew Olive, said, "Olive didn't mess around and expected those in struggle with her to hold the line and deliver." So whether one of 6 people protesting an arrest or later mythologized as the sole intervener, this story begins to help us understand how Morris approached in her short time a life's worth of activism centered on basic human rights. Or as British photographer Neil Kenlock describes it, Olive's fight for equality. The fight that she waged included being a founding member of the Brixton Black Panthers. Some accounts note the influence of U.S. Black Panther speakers who came to Britain to both gain support for the African American cause, as well as to forge diasporic connections with Black Britons coalescing under the Black Power banner. Other sources note the localized nature of the various Panther chapters around the UK, claiming a particularly active period from 1970 to 1973. So it might seem obvious during this period for Olive and other young Black radicals to take up Marxist Maoism. But as both activists and scholars note, there was much that Black Britons could gain by taking inspiration from Black Power ideology, but there were also contextual differences to consider. So one musician notes that there were fundamental differences in the sense that Black Americans, he said, were dragged kicking, screaming from the shores of Africa to an utterly hostile America. But he said, while my parents, they bought a ticket on the Windrush, bound for London. So Blacks from the Caribbean were actively recruited to come to the United Kingdom. And so I just wanted to highlight that as, I think, a distinction that gives the Black British activism a particular kind of context. They came, I think, as entitled citizens in a different way than African Americans fought for that kind of entitlement. So some of the things they were interested in or active against were racist immigration laws that sought to limit Black migration from this workforce that they had actively recruited. They also campaigned against what were called the sus laws, which allowed people to stop and search disproportionately young Black men on suspicion alone. They also fought segregation in education, which saw Black children's educational opportunities limited by classifying them as ESN, or educationally subnormal, and agitating for fair housing and employment opportunities. So, much like the women who formed the Black Women's Liberation Committee and SNCC, Morris and other women active in the UK Black Power movement experienced an inattention to issues of gender and sexism that motivated their splintering into single-sex Black women's organizations. So again, as I mentioned before, Morris helped establish 4 different Black women's groups. The Brixton Black Women's Group, and then 2 groups in Manchester, and then right before she died, the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent. So in addition to working with these women's groups, Olive Morris is often credited with instilling in those groups a political ideology, helping them to develop a particular ideology around their work. And it was based around the needs of ordinary Black people in the community. I think it's also important to note here that I want to shift the focus a bit, actually, to talk a bit about her work around housing. And she diverges from an expected path of Black women's activism when we consider her approach to housing equity through squatting. Like Lauren, I had a number of pictures to show you, and one of them shows Olive climbing onto the roof of a house. It became the front of the Squatter's Handbook, I think in 1979. So she'd been squatting a property, and her roommate had been arrested while she was at work, and when Olive came home, she just went right back in. So I think squatting vacant properties in times of housing shortages, substandard housing, lack of adequate government housing, and extortionate rents by private landlords has been a tradition in Britain since at least the 14th century. Olive and another activist, her friend Liz Turnbull, were the first people during Britain's late 1960s, early 1970s wave of squatting to take over a private residence as opposed to a government-owned residence. So it was located on Railton Road, and it's the same road where she intervened earlier with the man who was being arrested. So this squat would later become the site for a succession of leftist groups, including Tabore, a Black self-help bookstore, as well as Black feminist and anarchist organizations. In an interview with Liz Turnbull and Olive's partner at the time of her death, Mike McColgan, they differed on how Olive and Liz's activism within the squatting movement was received. Turnbull claims that the Panthers saw squatting as hippie-style activism and not part of Black struggle. McColgan agrees and asserts that members of Olive's Black women's group disapproved of Olive as a person, labeling her too hippie. These accusations are not limited to the UK, as my research on US black feminist organizations shows that black women in this country constantly have to repeat accusations of being too white or engaged in the white thing with their advocation of feminist ideology. I guess not unsurprisingly, Liz and Olive's early activism in the squatting movement is almost erased in the retelling of that period of British squatting history. So McCogan continues, the thing about Olive is she had a very easy relationship with anybody, black or white. If she thought they were on the side of justice and she didn't sort of say, this is going to be a black thing, that's going to be a white thing, I'm for justice. Turnbull questions whether this was true, and McColgan affirms it was. But Turnbull goes on to qualify her doubt. She says she, Olive, was always a part of black struggle, though she would work with anybody. Both Turnbull and McColgan note that though many black activists were standoffish about Morris and Turnbull's engagement with the squatting movement, that in hindsight it was quite progressive. Turnbull says yes, squatting was progressive, especially for black people who were homeless, and the community was overrun by property speculators. So I think in this sense, Morris starts to illuminate some of these principles of alliance building that I'd like to further research with this project. And so I'll just conclude with a statement about Olive Morris. In a number of photographs of her, she's usually right in the face of police, where there's one where she's cussing out landlords. And there were also pictures of Olive at demonstrations where she was walking alongside policemen who were patrolling the marches and sharing a joke with them. So I interpret these photos and the mythology around Morris as evidence of her evolving leadership role. She was bridging her own beliefs with those of the people around her. As her mother, Doris Morris, concludes, she was a freedom fighter. She just wanted to know that people were all right, free of exploitation. Thank you.
Good morning, afternoon, whichever it is, I've lost track. I am so pleased to be here. I want to thank the organizers for providing this wonderful forum for what clearly, as you can tell, is the ushering in of a lot of new work. And for me, I learned as much as I'm able to give, so I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I was so pleased to see the son of Buzz Johnson. I don't know him, but I'm sure his father would be so proud that he was standing there, and to indicate that it is true Buzz Johnson, and I think I say this in the very first line of the book, Left of Karl Marx, which I have cards for if you'd like to get one, that I met Buzz Johnson in 1985 in Birmingham, and he had just published a little book. I think of my mother, and it was in the life of Claudia Jones. And at that time, many of us were sort of very militantly black feminists and doing a lot of interesting confrontational work and so on. And he said to me and Carolyn Cooper from Jamaica, if y'all want to do any real black feminist work, this is a person y'all need to look at. And I bought the book from him and would use it periodically in my teaching from time to time in Binghamton, and gradually had to find work that looked at black feminism from a Caribbean point of view, and had to go to Claudia Jones, and then did not find a lot of material except a few clippings. We're pleased to say that there's a lot more material now in terms of what is left of her holdings is in the Schomburg now. And Buzz, I know, also has a collection there, 2 or 3 collections around, but the major one, the primary one, is now in the Schomburg. Anyway, I have to say this before I start. I was doing a sabbatical in Trinidad a year or so ago, and my person who was next door to me was Gordon Rowley, a Caribbean scholar, and he said to me, after the demise of British West Indian Airways, BWIA, which is now Caribbean Airlines, there are only two institutions left named West Indian. One is the University of the West Indies. The other is the cricket team. Now, I'm saying this because of a discussion that was held earlier. There's a famous Caribbean communist named Richard Moore who had written a piece called The Word Negro, Its origin and evil use. The word West Indian is a similar word. And whenever you say it, you invoke a host of separations, Columbus's era. You won't get a lot of people showing up seriously who define themselves as West Indians unless they're still operating from that older framework. So I always feel troubled when I see it because it creates these instant separations between the Anglophone Caribbean and the Hispanophone, the Dutch, and it plays, and the Francophone, and plays right back into that old colonial framework. So there's really no West Indian. This is a construct that was created by Columbus's mistake, and I don't use it. Many of us don't use it. There are very few institutions in the Caribbean named West Indian anymore. So I want to really challenge you to nothing that I write has that word, unless it's used like Negro is used in quotation marks. So don't go back to calling, inviting groups under that basis at all. Black would actually be a more inclusive term, yes, for some of those women. And I don't see it as an either or in terms of black or African American. Many of them slide in to each other easily, just as Lee Mullins indicated, because I went to a conference in Brazil, and I was so excited. I was in Brazil. I was on a Fulbright. I was so excited when I saw African American, some sort of conference. And I thought really I was going to run into a lot of people from the U.S. because I'd been away from home for a long time. And when I got there, there were no people from the U.S. It was people in South America who call themselves African American. And also there's an interesting concept they use called Afrodescendientes, across Venezuela. And I gather young radical Venezuelan is actually using Afro-ascendientes, so which I liked even better. And so all of that long to say, well, we're not going to go back there. Now, it is important from the outset to identify. I have a little bit of a cold residual, so excuse me if it sounds a bit congested. I am. Yeah. It is important to say from the outset that several Caribbean scholars have an explicit self-definition in a Caribbean radical intellectual tradition. And indeed, many of the major Pan-Africanist thinkers and activists came out of the Caribbean and North America. Until a forum like today's symposium, the naming of a radical intellectual tradition and of women in that radical intellectual tradition has remained a theoretical absence in the contemporary intellectual iterations that we have across the academy and so on. In the most recent issue of the journal Small Acts, there's a conversation section on my recent book, Claudia Jones, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones. I engage her as being an outsider, a sister outsider, in the same way that Audre Lorde defines it, a sister outsider to a range of radical intellectual traditions. And I see it, therefore, as constructed outside of U.S. civil rights discourse, absolutely outside of Caribbean intellectual and radical frameworks, and so on. In other words, when there's a calling out of that pantheon of Caribbean thinkers, it's all men, CLR, Padmore, Williams, and so on and so on. There's no women at all. Walter Rodney, everybody gets in there. So in other words, this is not a critique of the sort of U.S. erasure of her, which was affected by her deportation from the U.S. to London, but really a way in which this framework, I think, has not been constructed unless we construct it to really put back in all those people who automatically get erased, but also the ways in which the logic of our understanding of who is an important intellectual thinker, activist, is limited in many different ways. I am happy, though, that a new generation of scholarship is providing detail and reactivating a number of figures who have been deliberately erased by state power. Now, according to Gerald Horne, who is here and who will be speaking in the afternoon, in his book Black and Red, all black activist workers have been historically, at some point, assigned a communist label, whether it applied or not. And in my view, this labeling became one of the ways of disciplining those who would struggle for equity into a certain conformity. Or put another way, it reinforced and normalize the definitions and abuses that went into producing an ideal and complicit citizenry in the United States and other places. Normalize in this case for Americans unless you have to go through the naturalization process. And this is really an important point to understand, because unless you go through naturalization, you will never know that you are asked two questions. Are you a member of the Communist Party? Do you know people who have been members of the Communist Party? And this is the same question that was asked repeatedly during the McCarthy era, as you know, and all the clips of that period show you that. So then why is that then still the definition of the ideal citizenry? I think this is a question that some scholars are beginning to look at, and also how it creates the logic of this sort of complicit ideal subject. And of course the demonizing and the erasure of communism as a framework in U.S. context. Now, another story from Brazil. I was in Sao Paulo once with a group. We were going down the street and there was a sign for Communist Party, and I asked, what was that? I was like, what is a Communist Party sign? So in many locations, there's nothing hidden about being a member of the Communist Party. Of course, now across Latin America, we're seeing a whole lot of geography in terms of that, development as far as left parties and so on are concerned, but that's hopefully will provide a lot of other work. Anyway, okay, so at the macro level, a more contemporary answering, of that. Okay, great. I thought it was 0 minutes. He was holding it kind of funny. At the macro level, a more contemporary answering of that question is the example of then candidate and now President Obama, who, as we know, is a moderate centrist, neoliberal, is often still assigned to socialism by the right as a way of disciplining him even more into conformity, even as he works to rescue capitalism. And we've had really fascinating discussions about this, in the sense that, what does this mean? What does this mean for the rest of the world? And really disturbing. As many of us are, we both support but critique. I'm concerned about build-up in Afghanistan, and I'm concerned. And actually, he said he was going to go there. So that is amazing, isn't it? And I'm concerned about his comments about Chavez, as saying that he is the one who has created all this terrorism in Latin America. And of course, Chavez responded that he must be an ignoramus if he says this, because he knows that the world, the U.S. has always been involved in creating all these disturbances across Latin America. But that's another question. Anyway, the point is that the result has been the strategic conflation today of left as anything that critiques conservatism. But then what about people who were actually Marxists, communists or socialists in that period of intense reprisals that ran its course throughout the 1950s and 60s? Claudia Jones identified explicitly as Marxist-Leninist, and from the 1930s to her death in 1964 would be the object of the most intense reprisals, including imprisonment as a political prisoner, and finally deportation. And in the book I have a nice chronology of various arrests and the various ways in which she operated. She was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. She was also the Secretary of the Women's Commission with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and so on. People like Oliver Cox, also from Trinidad, also suffering reprisals as a communist, would address the issue of there being a world system which functioned to manage this resource extraction and its link to the subordination, thingification of black subjects. But specifically in the U.S., as McClendon reports, an extensive range of African Americans from a multitude of walks of life have advocated for Marxism as an instrument to advance black liberation. George Jackson would call himself a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Faninist. Fanon himself talks of having to stretch Marxism whenever you have to deal with colonialism. And Césaire, in his letter as he abandoned the Communist Party, talked about the limitations of Marxism. So basically what I was trying to get at is the ways in which, two things I suppose here, the ways in which intellectual work is often assigned to universities, and my point, or to academics, and my point is that outside of the universities, people like John Henry Clark would have much more respect than many intellectuals within the universities. And also many other people were doing all sorts of work in a lot of other avenues. Intellectual intellectual work, thinking work, and so on. So Claudia, in her speech to the court, would actually stand up and say to the judge that you dare not assume that black women think and speak and write. And the logic is that she claimed an intellectual space and a resistance to a certain kind of silencing. I spent a little bit of time talking about the ways in which Marxism ends up being limited in terms of raising a lot of questions that people like Claudia Jones wanted to get at. And significantly that she joins the Communist Party because of the Scottsboro Boys, and that came up early as well, trial. But also the invasion, Mussolini's invasion of Italy as well, of Ethiopia as well. Claudia Jones was born in, I'll just jump to the last part of this. Claudia Jones was born in Belmont, Trinidad, and there was a sister earlier who wondered about the international connections as far as she's concerned. And significantly, towards the end of her life, she met Mrs. Ransom Kuti. They were together at a conference in Japan on the hydrogen bomb, and Claudia actually passed one of the resolutions against the use of these kinds of highly militarized instruments of war against civilian populations and so on. And I would love to see the kind of work that would come out from the second generation of scholars, looking at the ways in which some of these women interacted with each other before internet and laptops, and before the ways that we could communicate easily and so on. Right. I'm saying all this is, it is very exciting work, and when I listen to young scholars talking about the work, this opens up a range of things. For example, there needs to be a study on Grace Campbell, who was the only woman in the African Blood Brotherhood, and did a great deal of organizing work as well. Born of Jamaican and African American parentage as well, and raised in Georgia and Washington D.C. So Claudia comes to born in Trinidad in 1915, joins her parents in Harlem in 1924, and attends schools in the U.S. She goes to Wadley High and so on. And at the age of 18, was then part of the first wave of Caribbean migrants who would be actively involved in the Communist Party. But one of the things that some of the earlier work does is to try to create her some sort of exceptional figure. But the point is that there were quite a number of people, African Americans and Caribbeans, in the Communist Party at that time ahead of her. Ahead of her was George Padmore in the party. Otto Huiswood is identified as one of the founders of the CPUSA as well. So you have that whole range of activists, intellectual and community workers involved in different ways in the Communist Party. I argue she actually becomes the kind of person who saw the party as a site, I should say, for her activity, but struggled with it as she struggled against some of the positions, consistently putting on the table the question of black women, the question of domestic workers, unions, and a whole range of other concerns. So I want to point out to you Joyce Moore Turner's book, Caribbean Crusaders in Harlem Renaissance, really an important book for documenting that period. She's the daughter of Richard Moore. Claude McKay, I know Winston James is working on Claude McKay, but his work with the Communist Party, his involvement as well, is significant. So tried, imprisoned in the U.S. as a political prisoner during the McCarthy period, and then deported in 1955. She was meant to be erased, making her way to London, doubly and then triply diasporized, as Stuart Hall would call it. Claudia Jones arrives in London just around the time of the Windrush, 1948, and the massive influx of Caribbeans into London, and therefore was able to have a role in shaping the nature of black community in London. Far from ever abandoning her Marxist politics, she found ways to reshape it, as I argue, in ways which expanded Marxism to account for black women, people of color, African Caribbean migrants, in Europe culture and so on, and so impacted that society that her burial left of Karl Marx is a fitting statement of the nature of politics as of life. So if you go to Highgate, as I did many, many times, I'm sure some of you have done this, and seen the Marx bus, it's like 11 feet tall. Every day there are new roses at the base of the Marx bus. There's a flat stone on the ground to the left, and that's Claudia Jones, minus all the trappings of the might of Marx, but surely buried left of Karl Marx. And my colleague at Cornell, Robert Harris, asked me once, how did she get to be buried left of Karl Marx? So you can ask that question. But since then, a number of things have happened. Two things. Historical marker have been placed for her. One in Portobello Road, just as you come out of that station at Westmount Park Road. And another one at the Carnival Village, documenting that she was the founder of the carnival that has become Notting Hill Carnival, which she created as a response to the riots, the race riots against black people in Afro-Caribbeans in London in 1958. There's a stamp, amazingly. They always give you a stamp in the end by the Royal Mail in her honor. Isn't that amazing? And then in the Trinidadian emancipation celebrations last year, when they called all the names, Garvey, Padmore, they added Claudia Jones.